No good deed goes unpunished, unless the soaking wet, shivering stranger you rescue from a flooded highway turns out to be the ruthless billionaire who just bought your company. What happens when a single father's act of nighttime charity accidentally hands him the keys to a corporate empire? The rain in Chicago that Thursday night wasn't just falling, it felt like it was being fired from a cannon. Anthony Patrick gripped the steering wheel of his beat-up 2012 Honda Accord. His knuckles, white as the windshield wipers, fought a losing battle against the deluge. He was bone-tired. As a single father and a mid-level project manager at Sterling and Croft Associates, a prominent but mismanaged architectural firm, Anthony's life was an endless loop of exhaustion. His wife, Sarah, had passed away from breast cancer 3 years ago, leaving him with mounting medical debt and their daughter, Lily, who was now 6 years old and waiting for him at home with their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Higgins. It was nearly 11:30 p.m. Anthony had been held back at the office by his supervisor, Richard Caldwell, to fix a mountain of structural compliance errors that Richard himself had lazily overlooked. Anthony's mind was fixated on getting home, paying the babysitter, and maybe getting 4 hours of sleep before the cycle started all over again. Then his headlights caught something in the heavy sheets of rain near the shoulder of Wacker Drive. At first, he thought it was debris. But as he slowed down, the shape materialized into a person. It was a woman, stumbling along the concrete barrier. She wasn't just caught in the rain. She looked like she had barely survived a shipwreck. Her trench coat was plastered to her body, covered in mud and grease, and she was limping heavily, missing one shoe. Every instinct of self-preservation told Anthony to keep driving. The city was dangerous at night, and stopping for a stranger in a downpour was how horror movies started. But then she tripped, falling hard onto her knees in a deep puddle, and she didn't get back up. The image shattered Anthony's hesitation. He thought of Lily, of what he would want someone to do if she were ever lost, and alone in the dark. Anthony pulled the Accord onto the shoulder, threw on the hazard lights, and grabbed a battered umbrella from the back seat. He rushed out into the freezing downpour. "Hey, miss, are you all right?" Anthony yelled over the roar of the traffic and the thunder. The woman flinched violently as he approached, throwing a hand up to shield her face. In the harsh yellow glow of the street lamps, Anthony saw that she was terrified. Her dark hair was matted to her pale face, her lip was bleeding, and her eyes darted around like a cornered animal. "Don't touch me," she gasped, her voice trembling, but possessing a strange, sharp edge. "I'm not going to hurt you," Anthony said gently, keeping his distance. He held the umbrella over her, letting himself get soaked instead. "You're freezing. You need to get out of this rain. Let me call an ambulance or the police." "No!" The panic in her voice spiked instantly. She grabbed his wrist with surprising strength, her nails digging into his skin. "No police, no hospitals. Please, if they find me." She trailed off, a profound dread washing over her features. Anthony's heart pounded. He was a father, an architect, not an action hero. But he couldn't leave her. "Okay," he said slowly. "No cops, but you can't stay here. My car is right there. I have a heater and a dry blanket in the back. Come on." She hesitated, her eyes searching his face for any sign of malice. Whatever she saw in Anthony's exhausted, gentle expression must have reassured her. She nodded once. Anthony helped her into the passenger seat, immediately blasting the heat. He handed her a plaid fleece blanket he kept for Lily's winter soccer games. As the car warmed up, the woman wrapped herself tightly, shivering uncontrollably. "I'm Anthony," he offered quietly, pulling the car back onto the road. "Serafina," she whispered, staring blankly at the dashboard. She didn't offer a last name, and Anthony didn't push. Are you hungry, Serafina? There's a 24-hour diner a few miles from here. It's quiet. We can get you some hot tea and figure out what to do." She nodded silently. 10 minutes later, they were sitting in a back booth at a neon-lit, greasy spoon diner on the outskirts of the city. The waitress, an older woman named Brenda, who knew Anthony from his late-night shifts, brought them 2 hot coffees and a plate of grilled cheese sandwiches without asking questions. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, Anthony got a better look at her. Despite the mud, the ruined clothes, and the exhaustion, there was an undeniable air of authority about her. The fabric of her ruined coat, though stained, looked incredibly expensive. She ate the grilled cheese ravenously, as if she hadn't eaten in days. To ease the thick tension, Anthony started talking. He didn't ask her who was chasing her, or how she ended up barefoot on Wacker Drive. Instead, he talked about mundane things to ground her. He talked about Lily's obsession with paleontology. He talked about his frustration with his job. "It's just tough," Anthony sighed, wrapping his hands around his coffee mug. "I'm an architect, but I spend my days fixing my boss's mistakes. Richard Caldwell. The guy is a menace. He cuts corners on safety protocols for high-rise developments just to save a few bucks on the budget. I'm currently fighting him over the structural integrity of a new commercial waterfront project. He wants to use subpar steel from an unverified vendor, and he expects me to sign off on the blueprints. If I do, and the building fails, I lose my license, or worse, people get hurt. If I don't sign, he fires me, and I need the company health insurance for my daughter's asthma medication." Serafina had stopped eating. She was staring at him, her dark eyes suddenly sharp and focused. "Why do you stay at a firm like that?" she asked, her voice steadying. "Because Sterling and Croft pays the bills, and single dads don't have the luxury of taking moral stands when rent is due," Anthony said with a sad smile. "Anyway, enough about my boring corporate drama." Anthony ended up paying for a room at a clean, secure motel down the street. He paid in cash to avoid any digital footprint, respecting her desperate plea for anonymity. He walked her to the door of room 114, handing her the key and a spare $20 bill. "Lock the deadbolt," Anthony instructed softly. "Get some sleep. I wrote my cell phone number on the back of this receipt. If you need anything tomorrow, you call me." Serafina stood in the doorway, clutching the oversized motel key. The guarded, fearful look had melted into something profoundly complicated. "Anthony," she said, her voice catching slightly, "why did you help me? You don't know me. I could be a criminal. I could be dangerous." Anthony gave a tired, genuine laugh. "You looked like someone who just needed a break. I know what that feels like. Good night, Serafina." He drove home, relieved the babysitter, checked on his sleeping daughter, and collapsed into bed at 3 a.m., assuming he would never see the mysterious woman from the rainstorm ever again. 3 days later, the atmosphere inside the downtown offices of Sterling and Croft Associates was toxic. Panic hung in the air thicker than the humidity of the approaching summer. Anthony sat at his drafting table, rubbing his temples. The rumors that had been circulating for weeks had finally been confirmed that morning. Sterling and Croft had been subjected to a hostile takeover. They had been completely bought out by Gallagher Holdings, a massive, ruthless global real estate conglomerate, known for liquidating underperforming assets and firing entire executive boards without blinking. The word on the floor was that the newly appointed CEO of Gallagher Holdings, a notoriously private billionaire who had just inherited the empire following her father's sudden death, was coming to the Chicago office today to conduct a personal, brutal audit. "Patrick, in my office. Now." Anthony groaned internally. Richard Caldwell stood in his office doorway, his face slick with nervous sweat, his tie loosened. Richard was a man who thrived on bullying subordinates, but withered under the scrutiny of superiors. Today, he looked like a man facing the firing squad. Anthony walked into the plush corner office and shut the door. "The Gallagher auditors are going to be here in less than an hour," Richard spat, pacing behind his mahogany desk. He shoved a thick stack of blueprints across the desk toward Anthony. It was the waterfront project. "I need your signature on these revised structural plans immediately." Anthony glanced at the papers, his jaw tightening. "Richard, I told you on Thursday. I'm not signing these. You haven't changed the steel vendor, and you've actually reduced the load-bearing supports in the underground parking structure to make room for more retail space. It's a disaster waiting to happen. It violates basic city codes." "City codes can be managed," Richard hissed, slamming his hand on the desk. "Gallagher Holdings doesn't care about the poetry of architecture, Anthony. They care about profit margins. If they see that this project is over budget because you want to use premium materials, they will axe the project, and they will axe us. You sign it, or you pack up your desk right now. Let's see how you pay for your kids' inhalers without a salary." Anthony felt a cold knot of dread in his stomach. It was the ultimate leverage, and Richard knew it. Anthony thought of Lily's smiling face, of the stack of past-due medical bills sitting on his kitchen counter. He picked up the pen, his hand trembling slightly. Before the pen could touch the paper, a commotion erupted outside the frosted glass walls of Richard's office. Voices were raised. The distinct, heavy thud of multiple footsteps marched across the hardwood floors of the bullpen. Richard paled, abandoning Anthony and rushing to open his office door. Anthony followed close behind. The entire office had fallen dead silent. Standing in the center of the room was a phalanx of men in tailored black suits, corporate security. Parting the sea of security was the executive team of Gallagher Holdings. At the front of the pack was the new CEO. Anthony's breath caught in his throat. He froze, the pen slipping from his fingers and clattering to the floor. It was her. She was no longer the muddy, shivering, barefoot woman crying in the rain. Serafina was a vision of absolute, terrifying power. She wore a razor-sharp, custom-tailored charcoal Tom Ford suit. Her dark hair was sleek and perfectly styled. The vulnerability he had seen in the diner was entirely gone, replaced by an aura of cold, calculated dominance. She carried a leather portfolio, her eyes scanning the room like a hawk looking for field mice. Beside her stood an older, sour-faced man who looked remarkably like her. Harrison Gallagher, her step-brother, who the tabloids said had violently opposed her ascension to CEO. "Listen up," Serafina's voice rang out, clear and commanding. It was the same voice from the car, but stripped of all fear. "I am Serafina Gallagher. Effective immediately, Gallagher Holdings is taking full operational control of Sterling and Croft. Every project, every ledger, and every employee is under review. If we find bloat, corruption, or incompetence, you will be escorted out of the building today." Richard Caldwell practically tripped over his own feet as he rushed forward, plastering on a desperate, sycophantic smile. "Miss Gallagher, welcome. Welcome to Chicago," Richard groveled, extending a sweaty hand that Serafina completely ignored. "I am Richard Caldwell, Senior Managing Director. We are thrilled to integrate with Gallagher Holdings. In fact, I have my team working double time. We've already managed to trim the budget on the new commercial waterfront project by 14%. Serafina slowly turned her gaze to Richard. Her eyes were like shards of black ice. 14%, Mr. Caldwell?" Serafina asked softly. The silence in the room was deafening. "That is quite a margin. Tell me, how exactly did you achieve such impressive savings?" "Efficiency, Miss Gallagher," Richard beamed, thinking he was winning her over. "Streamlining resources, optimizing vendor relationships. Is that right? Serafina took a single step closer to Richard. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Because it has come to my attention that your optimization involves sourcing unverified, substandard steel from shell companies and dangerously reducing load-bearing supports in the parking structures to cram in more retail space. A decision that grossly violates municipal safety codes. Richard's face drained of all color. His mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. I assure you, Ms. Gallagher, that is a misunderstanding. The preliminary designs were drafted by my subordinate, a project manager. He is entirely responsible for those oversights. In fact, I was just reprimanding him. Richard pointed a shaking finger directly at Anthony, who was standing a few feet away. Anthony Patrick. He drafted those flawed blueprints. Harrison Gallagher, standing behind his sister, sneered. Well, fire the architect immediately, Serafina. We don't need liabilities. Serafina slowly turned her head, her gaze following Richard's pointing finger. Her eyes locked onto Anthony. For a fraction of a second, the titanium mask of the billionaire CEO slipped. A flicker of recognition, of profound gratitude, flashed across her face. She looked at his worn-out suit, remembered the hot coffee, the $20 bill, and the man who had asked for nothing in return while saving her life from Harrison's hired thugs just 3 nights ago. She turned back to Richard Caldwell. Mr. Caldwell, Serafina said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal whisper. I despise liars. But more than that, I despise cowards who pass the blame onto their subordinates. I happen to know, on extremely good authority, that Anthony Patrick has been actively fighting your negligent budget cuts, refusing to sign off on your death trap blueprints at the risk of his own employment. Richard gasped, stumbling back a step. How could you possibly know that? Serafina didn't answer him. She snapped her fingers, and a security guard stepped forward with a termination folder. Richard Caldwell, you are fired, effective immediately. Security will watch you pack your personal items. You have 5 minutes to vacate my building. We will also be pursuing legal action against you for attempted corporate fraud and endangering public safety. As Richard began to hyperventilate and was roughly escorted toward his office by the guards, the entire bullpen remained paralyzed in shock. Serafina adjusted her suit jacket, her eyes scanning the terrified employees before settling once again on Anthony. A very faint, knowing smirk touched the corner of her lips. Mr. Patrick, she announced, her voice echoing through the silent office. Gather your things and come to the executive boardroom. We have a lot of work to do, and I am in need of a new senior managing director. Anthony's footsteps felt heavier than lead as he walked down the glass-paneled hallway toward the executive boardroom. The entire office was in a state of paralyzed shock. Whispers trailed him like ghosts, but he tuned them out, his pulse hammering against his ribs. 10 minutes ago, he was a desperate single father clinging to a sinking job. Now, he was being summoned by the billionaire who had just decapitated the firm's leadership. He pushed open the heavy oak doors of the boardroom. The space was immense, dominated by a long mahogany table and panoramic views of the Chicago skyline. Serafina Gallagher stood at the head of the table, her hands resting flat against the polished wood. Her stepbrother Harrison paced furiously near the floor-to-ceiling windows, his face flushed with a dangerous cocktail of rage and panic. 2 of Serafina's corporate security men stood silently by the door. Have a seat, Anthony, Serafina said. Her tone was strictly professional, but as her eyes met his, the cold edge softened just a fraction. Anthony took a seat near the middle of the table, placing his battered leather briefcase on the floor. This is a farce, Serafina, Harrison snarled, spinning around to face her. You are completely out of your depth. You waltz in here, fire the senior managing director without a formal board review, and replace him with a glorified draftsman. The shareholders will crucify you by morning." "The shareholders," Serafina replied, her voice dangerously calm, "will be far more interested in why you spent the last 48 hours trying to prevent me from assuming my legal role as CEO following our father's death." Anthony sat perfectly still, absorbing the gravity of her words. The pieces were rapidly snapping together. Serafina turned her attention back to Anthony, though her words were clearly meant for the entire room. "Last Thursday evening, I was scheduled to sign the final succession documents, transferring Gallagher Holdings to my control. Before I could reach the lawyer's office, my town car was intercepted on Wacker Drive by 2 unmarked SUVs. My driver was incapacitated. I managed to escape into the storm." She paused, casting a lethal glare at her stepbrother. "I had no phone, no security, and I knew whoever was after me had access to the Chicago police dispatch. I was hunted. And if a certain stranger hadn't pulled over in the middle of a torrential downpour, offered me a blanket, and hidden me in a roadside motel, I would not be standing here today." Harrison scoffed, though a bead of sweat rolled down his temple. A touching fairy tale. What does this have to do with Sterling and Croft? Why are we in this miserable regional office instead of headquarters? "Because," Serafina stepped away from the table, walking slowly toward the projector screen at the back of the room. "My attackers weren't just trying to stop me from becoming CEO. They were trying to buy time to bury something massive, something hidden right here in Chicago." She pressed a button on a remote, and the projector flared to life. Complex spreadsheets and architectural schematics filled the screen. Anthony instantly recognized them. They were the blueprints for the commercial waterfront development, the very project Richard Caldwell had tried to force him to sign off on. Over the last 3 years, Gallagher Holdings' real estate development fund has hemorrhaged over $40 million in unforeseen material costs across 6 different Midwest projects, Serafina explained. All of those projects were contracted out to Sterling and Croft. All of them were overseen by Richard Caldwell. Harrison's jaw tightened. "Construction is volatile. Material costs fluctuate." "They do," Serafina agreed smoothly. "But they don't usually fluctuate into the offshore bank accounts of a shell company called Apex Ironworks, a company that, according to the digital paper trail my forensic accountants unearthed this morning, is entirely owned by a holding trust under your name, Harrison." The silence in the room was absolute. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and lethal. "You were using Caldwell to draft buildings with artificially inflated material budgets," Serafina continued, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "You sourced cheap, unverified steel from your own phantom company, billed Gallagher Holdings for premium materials, and pocketed the difference. Caldwell got his bonuses for staying under budget, and you siphoned tens of millions from our father's legacy. You have absolutely no proof that the steel on those blueprints is linked to Apex?" Harrison spat, though his voice lacked its previous volume. "These are just numbers on a screen. Any auditor would laugh you out of the room." Serafina didn't flinch. Instead, she looked directly at Anthony. "That is where you come in, Mr. Patrick," she said quietly. "Harrison is right. I am not an architect. My accountants can trace the money, but they cannot prove the physical deception in the building plans. Can you?" Anthony looked at the screen. He looked at the furious, cornered billionaire pacing by the window, and then at the woman he had bought a grilled cheese sandwich for just days prior. The stakes of his life had never been higher. But suddenly, the chronic anxiety that had plagued him for years vanished. He wasn't just fighting for his job anymore. He was fighting for the truth. Anthony stood up. He walked to the head of the table, pulling a laser pointer from his suit pocket. "Mr. Gallagher is mistaken," Anthony said, his voice steady, carrying the quiet authority of a man who knew his craft inside and out. "The proof isn't just in the money. It's baked into the math of the buildings themselves." Anthony clicked the pointer, circling a cross-section of the underground parking structure on the screen. "For the past 3 weeks, Richard Caldwell demanded I authorize these revised load-bearing schematics. On paper, the required tensile strength of the structural I-beams was listed at 50,000 pounds per square inch, the standard for high-rise commercial foundations." Anthony clicked to the next slide, showing a dense bill of materials. However, if you cross-reference the specific metallurgical alloy codes listed in the purchasing orders routed to Apex Ironworks, you'll see they are classified under a completely different industrial index. This isn't high-grade construction steel. It's grade 33, salvaged, low-yield carbon steel. It maxes out at 36,000 pounds per square inch. Anthony turned to look directly at Harrison, his eyes narrowing. If we had built the waterfront project using these materials, the moment the winter freeze-thaw cycle hit the concrete, the foundation would have fractured. The building wouldn't just be a bad investment, Mr. Gallagher. It would be a mass casualty event. "You are going to let a skyscraper collapse just to hide your embezzlement." Harrison lunged forward, slamming his fists on the table. "You arrogant little pencil pusher! You think anyone is going to take the word of a disgruntled mid-level manager over a Gallagher? I'll have you blacklisted from every architectural firm in North America. You'll be begging for scraps on the street." "He won't be looking for a job, Harrison," Serafina interrupted, her voice cutting through the room like a whip. She pulled a thick leather folder from her portfolio and tossed it onto the center of the table. "The Chicago Police Department's white-collar crime unit is currently in the lobby," Serafina stated, checking her platinum wristwatch. "They have warrants for Richard Caldwell's hard drives, and they have a warrant for your arrest regarding corporate fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit grievous bodily harm." Harrison froze. The blood drained entirely from his face as the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open. 3 uniformed officers, flanked by a lead detective, stepped into the room. "Harrison Gallagher?" the detective asked, stepping forward with a pair of handcuffs. Harrison didn't fight. The reality of his absolute defeat seemed to crush him into silence. He cast one final venomous look at his sister before being escorted out of the boardroom, his footsteps fading down the glass hallway. When the doors clicked shut, the overwhelming tension in the room finally broke. The 2 security guards stepped outside to give them privacy. Serafina let out a long, shaky breath, leaning her hands on the table. For a fleeting second, Anthony saw the exhausted woman from the diner again. "It's over," she whispered, mostly to herself. Then she stood up straight and turned to Anthony. The mask of the CEO was back, but her eyes were incredibly warm. "I apologize for the theatrics, Anthony," she said, walking over to him. "But I needed Caldwell and Harrison in the same room, and I needed your expertise on the record to seal the trap. You certainly know how to make an impression on your first day, Ms. Gallagher," Anthony said, a relieved, tired smile breaking across his face. "Serafina, please," she corrected him softly. She walked over to her portfolio and pulled out a crisp, heavy stock document, handing it to him. "What is this?" Anthony asked, looking down at the legal text. "That is your new contract," Serafina said. "As of today, Sterling and Croft is being dissolved and rebranded under the Gallagher Holdings umbrella. I am appointing you as the Regional Director of Architecture and Urban Planning for the entire Midwest Division." Anthony's eyes went wide as he read the numbers on the page. The salary was staggering, more than he could have made in 10 years under Richard Caldwell. but his eyes immediately darted down to the benefits section. Full premium healthcare, Serafina noted, following his gaze. No deductibles. Top-tier pediatric specialists included. Your daughter Lily will never have to worry about her asthma treatments again. Tears pricked the corners of Anthony's eyes. He swallowed hard, overwhelmed by the sudden, seismic shift in his universe. Serafina, I don't know what to say. You don't owe me this. I just gave you a ride and a motel room. You gave me my life, Serafina corrected fiercely. When everyone else in my world saw me as a target, an obstacle, or a dollar sign, you just saw a person who needed help. You risked your own safety for a stranger, and you risked your career to protect people who would never even know your name. That kind of integrity cannot be bought, Anthony, but it can be rewarded. She extended her hand. Do we have a deal, Mr. Patrick? Anthony looked at the contract, thought of his daughter waiting at home, and felt the crushing weight of the past 3 years finally lift off his shoulders. He reached out and shook the billionaire's hand firmly. We have a deal, Serafina. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the dark clouds that had hung over Chicago for days finally began to break, letting the first bright rays of afternoon sunlight wash over the city skyline. True power isn't measured by the wealth in your bank account, but by the integrity you maintain when you think no one is watching. Anthony Pendleton's choice to pull over in a storm saved a corporate empire, but more importantly, it proved that decency still yields the highest dividends. When you build your life on a foundation of compassion, even the most ruthless storms cannot tear it down.